Hey, what's up everyone? This is Music Tech Help Guy and welcome to part 9 of my Logic Pro 11 Essentials course. In this video, I'll give you an overview of how to use MIDI-based software instruments in Logic Pro. I'll show you how to make MIDI recordings, and I'll also give you a quick flyover of MIDI fundamentals. MIDI stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface, and it is a technical standard that includes a communication protocol, so otherwise a computer language, and some standardized MIDI connectors, although most of these are not used anymore since almost everything in the MIDI world is using USB these days. MIDI allows musical devices to communicate with each other using a non-proprietary protocol. The original version of MIDI 1.0 was released to the public in 1983, and it's gone through several updates over the years, including a general MIDI update in the early 90s, along with MIDI 2.0 more recently. The whole reason why MIDI was necessary is because back in the 80s, there was not a standardized way of making musical devices communicate with each other. For example, if I wanted to send musical information from a keyboard over to a hardware synthesizer, it would require a proprietary system. The two devices had to use the same language. And because nothing was standardized back then, everything was proprietary. MIDI standardized digital musical information. So when you play a key on your MIDI controller, that musical data is sent over to Logic or any DAW and tells Logic, hey, I'm playing a C#3 at a certain dynamic. So for notes, it doesn't just communicate the information about the pitch of the note itself, it also sends information about how hard or how fast you hit the key. This is called velocity, and we'll be working with velocity in many different ways over the next several videos. For example, if I play a note as soft as I possibly can, that is going to be a velocity of 1. A velocity of 0 would just be a note off. And then if I hit that same key really hard and really fast, it gets a velocity of 127. And then you can play dynamics anywhere within that 0 to 127 or 1 to 127 range. Logic's piano roll editor actually colorizes notes based on their velocity, and velocity values can be edited and adjusted after MIDI recordings are made. But MIDI is not just limited to notes. Any beat pads, knobs, and faders you might have on your MIDI controller are also controlled with MIDI. And all of the values associated with these controls are standardized, just like velocity. 0 to 127 is the standardized range of MIDI values. And this also includes controls like modulation wheel and pitch bend. Now, technically speaking, pitch bend is at a higher resolution than modulation wheel and faders and knobs, but the concept is essentially the same. So this whole concept of opening up a DAW, loading up a software instrument, and then using a MIDI controller to play in notes and have the computer generate sound for you is really something that's only been around in the mainstream for the past 30 years or so. Really, the last 20 years is where software instruments have gone from being just really super basic to having all sorts of controls and modulation and advanced sampling functions. If the invention of the digital audio workstation is the #1 most important innovation in music technology in the past 50 years, then MIDI is a very close #2 in my book. Speaking of MIDI, let me show you how you can use today's sponsor, Boombox, to help you generate MIDI musical ideas to kickstart your creative process. In addition to the great file storage and collaboration tools that Boombox has to offer, there's also a new AI co-writer called Boombot AI. In particular, I'm a huge fan of the chord progression generator. Here I've generated an 8-bar chord progression for a song verse. I'll save this to my Boombox account, where it'll be saved as a MIDI file. Then I'll make a second progression for a pre-chorus. I'll give the AI some feedback by telling it to start on the A flat chord this time. Now I've got 2 progressions saved to my Boombox account. I can download these as MIDI files and drop them into my Logic project, and I've got a working chord progression that can serve as a song starter. If you want to check out Boombox for yourself, head over to boombox.io today and sign up to get 4 GB of free storage. Okay, so I've got a fresh Logic project here, and for demonstration purposes, I'm just going to build a really basic MIDI musical arrangement just to show you how to get started. I'm going to start with a MIDI software instrument, and you can choose to load a default patch. All this is going to do is load up an electric piano patch. So I'm going to set this to empty channel strip so I get a blank software instrument track. And I'm just going to create one track for now, but if you wanted multiples, you could type in whatever number you want here. So I've got my first software instrument here, and it pulls up the library, and this is where you can choose different software instrument patches. And remember, you can hide and show the library by pressing Y. I'm going to hide it for now because before I select a software instrument, I want to have a rhythmic reference for me to play to. I want some drums. And we're going to talk more about using the step sequencer to build your own drum patterns and beats in a future video very soon. But just for now, let's drag in a drum loop just so we can have something to play in time to. So I'm going to open up the loop browser. And again, remember, loop browser can be opened up with O. And I'm going to search for a drum loop called Big Body Beat. There it is. You can see it's at 72 BPM. My project's at 120. So when I drag this in, it's going to automatically change the tempo because it's the first loop in the project. Now, personally, I like to start my projects on bar 2. And the reason why, well, there's a lot of different reasons why, but the main reason why is sometimes if you start right at bar 1 and you start playing in MIDI notes, like if I play a chord right there at bar 1, if you play ahead of the bar, which we are inclined to do quite often, those notes can get cut off. So that's what I'm trying to avoid. There are a lot of other reasons why I do this, but I generally speaking start my songs on bar 2. And then when I export or bounce out the final project, we can set a bounce range that doesn't include this first bar. And we'll talk about that later on in the course. So I'm just going to stick the loop here at bar 2. I'm going to hit Command R to repeat it just one time. And then let's go ahead and choose our first software instrument. So with the instrument track selected, you can press Y to open the library, and you can search through the different categories, or you can search for a specific sound. I'm going to go to Synthesizer, Pad, and I'm going to select this one called Chill Out. Now, some software instruments are going to look like this, where there's like an enclosing folder. Inside of this folder is the instrument itself. You can see here in the inspector, this is the retro synth. That's the actual instrument that's loaded up on that track. So the instrument will be shown in green and other effects will be shown in blue. There are also MIDI effects we'll come back to in just a bit. And this is an aux track or an auxiliary channel strip. This is essentially just an effects track. So sometimes you'll see that these library presets are actually these little enclosing folders called track stacks, which we're going to come back to later. And other times they'll just be an individual instrument track, and we'll encounter that later on in this video. So I'm going to record enable this track, and I have my Alesis V25 MIDI controller plugged in over USB. If you're not sure if Logic is recognizing your MIDI controller, all you need to do is go up to Logic Pro, Settings, MIDI, and then from Inputs, make sure that your device is being shown here. If not, there's a chance that Logic isn't recognizing it because you need to install some proprietary software or driver for your device. Although most MIDI controllers these days are class compliant, meaning you can just plug them in and they just work. So those are the chords I'm going to play. I think I'm going to do A minor 7, F major 7, some sort of G add 6 sort of thing. Actually, it's a E minor first inversion, and then E minor 7. That's going to be my chord progression that I'm going to work off of. We already have a 1-bar count in here because of that 1-bar gap we added. So if you keep your count in turned on, you're actually going to get 2 bars of count in. If I hit R to record, watch what happens. So it starts before bar 1. Now we're at bar 1, and then we'd enter at bar 2. So in this situation, I don't really think we need the count in because we already have this count in here. I'm just going to set the playhead 1 bar before where I start recording, although I do want my metronome turned on so I know when to come in. So I'm just going to press R to record, and I'm going to play in those chords. I'm going to go ahead and hide the library for now. and then just press spacebar to stop. So this is a MIDI recording, or a MIDI region. I can double click on it. This will open up the piano roll editor, which is a MIDI editor. So you can see your piano keyboard over here showing all of the pitches for each of the notes. And one of the things I explained in the intro to this video was that Logic colorizes its notes based on velocity. So notes that are more like purple and blue or green are going to be lower velocities, while notes that are at higher velocities are going to be more like red or orange or yellow. So this velocity slider allows you to individually control the velocity for each note. Now, as you select notes, you're going to hear that they play. If you don't want the notes to play, you can turn off this option here. This is the MIDI output option. So now you can edit notes and select notes freely without hearing them play back. Now, another little quick trick here is if you want all of the notes to be the same velocity, if you move the velocity slider, it's just going to adjust them all relative to each other. But if you hold Option while you adjust the velocity slider, you'll see it sets them all to the same value. So now all of my notes are at 97. What you'll also notice is that the notes are not exactly on the grid, and that's just because humans tend to play ahead of the grid. You know, we tend to rush. So one way you can correct this is to use something called quantization or quantizing. It's essentially rhythmic or timing correction of the MIDI notes. Now, I'm going to show you a really basic way of doing it in this video, but we'll talk about all of the advanced quantization tools down here in a future video. But for now, you can just select a MIDI region and then press Q on your keyboard. And what this will do is it'll automatically quantize all of those notes to move to their nearest 16th note. That's the default setting, although that setting can be changed. So I'll hit E to close out the piano roll editor, click on my region, and press Command R to repeat. Okay, so we've got a good foundation to work with. Next, let's add in some sort of like a synth lead or synth bass. Now, there's a couple different ways to create new tracks. I've already shown you, you can click the plus button here and you can create a new track that way. You can also use the key command Option Command N to bring up the new track dialog. But another quick way is if you already have a software instrument out here, if you just double click below the lowest track, it'll actually create that type of track. So because I had a software instrument selected, it created a software instrument. If I have an audio track selected and I double click, it'll create an audio track. So it's just a real quick way to create new tracks. So let's zoom that up. Let's zoom that up a little bit as well, just to make some room there. And let's choose a new instrument. So let's go back to our library. Let's go to synthesizer, bass, and I'm going to choose this agile synth bass. And what you'll notice about this instrument is that it's not in a track stack. See how this one's in a folder, this one's just its own track. And that's because there's nothing on the track other than its instrument, which is Alchemy. And we'll come back to Alchemy in just a second here. But let's see what this sounds like. So let's play in just like a really simple bass line to follow these chords. Before I do that, though, I'm going to come up here to the LCD display and let's set this to custom view because I want to show you a really cool feature up here called the MIDI monitor. This can monitor your MIDI input and MIDI output. So if I play a note, watch what happens. Those values are showing you what type of MIDI message it is, the MIDI channel, which is channel 1, the pitch, which is C3, and then to the right of that is the velocity value. So a softer velocity, a lower value, a harder or faster velocity, a higher value. One other thing that's worth mentioning is that C3 in most DAWs is middle C, whereas if you learned music theory or you learned music more traditionally, you learned the piano as a kid, C4 is middle C. It doesn't mean that the pitch of the note has changed, just the numbers have shifted. And you're going to find that in almost all DAWs, middle C is C3 by default. And you can change that by going up to Logic Pro, Settings, and then View. And then under the General tab, toward the bottom, it'll say Display Middle C as C3, which is the Yamaha standard, or C4, which is the Roland standard. I've pretty much spent the last 20 years of my life using C3 as middle C in DAWs, even though I did learn theory traditionally, so I prefer using C3. It doesn't really matter. All it's doing is changing the number. It's not actually transposing the pitch up or down by an octave. So it's completely your choice whether you want to use C3 or C4. Okay, I'm going to hit R and let's record in this bass line. Once again, I can double click to open this up in the piano roll editor. I can select the region and hit Q to quantize, hit E to hide the editor, and then let's trim this up so it's exactly 4 bars in length, and hit Command R to repeat. Now you'll notice I'm getting a little bit of clipping here. If you start clipping, just hit X to open up your mixer and pull down the level of all of your tracks, not including the stereo output or master VCA. I can drag over these, hit Command U to set the cycle range around the regions. And let's give this a listen. Now, at the beginning of this video, I mentioned that MIDI messages are generally conveyed with a value from 0 to 127. This includes not only the notes and velocities, it also includes other controls. This one right here is called the modulation wheel, and you'll find that a lot of software instruments in Logic have an additional effect paired to the modulation wheel. And so I've got the chill out pad here selected again, and let's see what that effect sounds like. So we get a little bit of like a filter sweep from the modulation wheel. And if you look at the MIDI monitor up at the top, you'll see that this is telling us this is a knob or fader or a modulation control. Technically, these are called control change messages or continuous controllers. MIDI channel 1, the second one is telling us that this is control number 1. And then, of course, the range all the way down at 0 or all the way up at 127. The knobs function exactly the same. Again, it's showing that this is a continuous controller on channel 1. The number 20 is the actual knob number itself, the CC number. And then, of course, all the way down to 0, all the way up is 127. And you can see this is repeated for all of the other knobs. Now, there aren't actually effects tied to these controls, only modulation wheel in this case, but we've already recorded our MIDI. Can we record our modulation wheel in separately? You absolutely can. So this should just work by default, but let me show you how to set this up just in case. Go up to Logic Pro, Settings, Recording, and right here there's an option that says Overlapping Track Recordings MIDI, Cycle On, Cycle Off, and they're both set to merge. I believe that is the default setting. And so what that means is if I just hit R to record and I move my modulation wheel and I don't actually play any notes, it's just going to add the modulation wheel MIDI data into these existing regions. So what I'm going to do to start is I'm just going to drag over both of these and press J to join them together. And then I'm going to hit R and I'm going to slowly sweep around the filter and record in that performance in addition to the chords that are already there. And you can see it's merged in that MIDI controller data into the MIDI region, and it'll now play back that exact same way. Sometimes you'll be able to choose the presets from within the instrument. And actually, all cases, you're able to do that. Alchemy just happens to have its own little browser here of its own presets that are independent of some of the presets here in the library. Now, if your instrument that you're opening up doesn't have its own browser, which a lot of the stock Logic instruments don't, you can find all of their presets up here in this top menu. So if I wanted to find a different bass here, I could totally do that. That's not a bass, but I could select a different bass here and try that out. Okay, I think the Agile synth bass is probably the best option here, the better option here. Okay, so let's add in one more track. Let's add in sort of like a synth lead or something to give this some melody. So I'm just going to double click to create a new software instrument. Let's pull it up to the top. Let's open up the library. Let's go to synthesizer lead, and let's do this one, alien lead. So I'm going to play in something like that. But one thing I want to point out here is on some instruments, you'll find effects. So this one has like an EQ on it. This also has a delay on it. So if I want more of that delay effect, I can pull that in. Maybe that's a bit much. And maybe I want to add like a different effect on here. Maybe I want to add some reverb. I can go down to reverb. I can choose a reverb plugin. I can choose a preset. Let's try out the Synth Hall. And in reverb plugins, the dry signal is like the unaffected signal, and the wet signal is the reverb signal. Let's make the decay time a little longer. And another thing you can add on here are MIDI effects. If you click here, you'll see there are a bunch of different MIDI effects you can choose from. Most of these are outside the scope of this course, but the arpeggiator is actually a quite easy one to start using. And all the presets are up here at the top. So if you want to experiment with MIDI effects, you can add those after the fact, or you can add them in advance of your recording. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to play in some individual notes here. Okay, I'll double click on this. Let's look at it in the MIDI editor. Let's hit Q to quantize it, hit Command R to repeat it. But one thing I don't like about this lead is it sounds like it's a little low. Now, there's different ways you can deal with this. You can deal with this on your MIDI controller. Most of them will have an octave up or down button. So if I want to go up an octave, I can do that. Or if I want to go lower, that sounds more like an appropriate range for this lead. But if you've already made the recording in Logic, you can actually transpose those notes up or down by an octave very easily. All you have to do is select those MIDI regions and then hold Option and Shift and press up or down. So up will transpose up by 12 semitones or 1 octave. And then Option Shift down will transpose down by an octave. So let's pull those up by an octave, and you'll see this little plus 12 on the regions denoting that it's been transposed up by 12 semitones. And then once you've made your recording, you can go into your effects, you can customize your effects. You can hit X again to bring up the mixer and customize the mix to your liking. Okay, I want to show you one last MIDI function in Logic that's actually kind of a newer function. This is one of the updates they added to it was in one of the Logic 10.7 updates. This is called free tempo recording. And you can find this up here on the transport. It's this button right here. It's the record button with like the dashed circle around it. If you don't see that, just right click or control click up here on the control bar and then select customize control bar and display. And make sure under transport, you see free tempo recording shown. Now, if you're brand new to playing keyboard or playing with MIDI controllers, and you're not great at staying in time with the metronome, free tempo recording can be really helpful for getting like a solid foundation of chords down. So for example, if I hit free tempo record and then just play in some chords, and then I hit spacebar to stop, this is going to give me a few options to choose from. I can apply region tempo to project, meaning I'm applying the tempo of the region to my project, which I don't want. Apply average region tempo, apply project tempo to region, or you can not analyze this. If you choose this option, apply project tempo to region, what this is going to do is it's going to do its best to automatically adjust the MIDI data so that it lines up with the grid. So you can see it's basically created 4 whole note chords for me. They're a little shorter than whole notes that I can loop out, I can add a beat to, and I can start building a new section without having to play in time to the metronome. So that's free tempo recording. It doesn't always work like magic. You know, if you're really off, if your timing is really off, you're just going to confuse it. But if you're playing like basic things like whole notes and half notes and quarter notes, generally speaking, it'll be able to put your MIDI recordings on the grid. So this is just a quick way to sort of spitball MIDI ideas and get them into your project without having to play to a click. Okay, so that's an introduction to MIDI and software instruments in Logic Pro. Go crazy with this. Start making beats, start building compositions. Again, even if this is your first time doing this, you don't have to strive for perfection. Part of it's just practicing this and learning the skill so that later on you can build some full songs and full compositions. But using MIDI and software instruments is really your first sort of entry point into building and making electronic music arrangements and non-electronic music arrangements in Logic. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to see more content like this. As always, thank you so much for the support, and thanks for watching.